Welcome to FAFSA Tips and Tricks. My name is Leah Young. I am the Student Success Resource Lead here at Juno, and I am also work a lot with financial aid offices, undergrad students, graduate students, and I've been in the financial aid sphere for about 20 years, working across lots of different institutions, including Dickinson College, where I worked as the Assistant Vice President for Enrollment and Director of Financial Aid. All that to say that I think I can be helpful on this session, and would love to just check in and hear where our folks are, where they're joining us at in the process. Are you students yourselves? Are you parents of juniors or seniors? Are you working through the process already? And would love if you just throw that in the chat. You can either send that directly to host and panelists, or you can be more open in the chat and send it to everyone, whatever you prefer. Would love to just get a sense for who's on the call, where you are in the process. We're going to cover all the timelines associated with this process. We're going to talk about what is the FAFSA, what's its purpose, what you need to successfully complete it, who needs to complete the FAFSA, a few key things you need to know in each section to make sure you fill it out correctly. As someone who spent a lot of time in a financial aid office, I have seen many, many mistakes made on that FAFSA form, and we're going to help you avoid those. And then what happens after you complete the FAFSA, how that data is used, and how Juno can serve to fit into that timeline. And I'm also going to be previewing our newest tool, which is a financial aid, basically a reconsideration request, an appeal letter. So if you've completed your FAFSA, gotten your financial aid award, and you're wondering how to negotiate that, we do have other webinars that are listed on our site at joinjuno.com/webinars, where you can always see the next upcoming one. That's one we do pretty frequently. And this is a tool that will help you generate your financial aid reconsideration request, appeal request, and tell you, like what kind of supporting documents you might need to have that considered. It just launched today, so I'm excited to share that with you, and it's always free for families to use, just like all of our resources. All right, we've got parents of a high schooler here, a couple of those, some juniors, some seniors. Great. Thank you for sharing in the chat as I take a look at that. Fantastic. You can feel free to throw your questions in either the chat or the Q&A, and I'll pop in there periodically and make sure they get addressed. All right, so for those of you who are parents of juniors, you have some time to fill out the FAFSA. The earliest you can typically do that is October 1st. And then as you go on the timeline, soon after you submit that, you get something called the Student Aid Index. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. We also have a separate webinar that dives deep into the calculations of that Student Aid Index and what it means. We cover it very lightly towards the end, but if you really want to deep dive into how the FAFSA calculates that Student Aid Index, that number that is associated with your need, definitely check out one of our future webinars. Typically, students are applying to college throughout the fall, typically submitting those forms, around the holidays, though some schools have rolling admissions and we're still seeing some of students apply now. Typically, financial aid decisions are awarded sometime in the March and April timeframe. You might get merit decisions earlier if you're applying to a school that does rolling admissions and releases them at the time of admission, but typically financial aid need awards get released right around now through April, essentially if that FAFSA is ready. If you're not able to make that work with your financial aid offer, or you've got other offers that are just pulling you stronger from the one that your student really wants to attend, you may want to look at appealing that financial aid offer. Again, we have a whole session on that in our webinars, and you typically decide which school to attend around early May. and then research and apply for student loans if applicable. And then tuition is typically due in August. So we've got a question about, not qualifying based on income, but I have debts. Does it still help to apply for FAFSA? And so it if you're going to need, if your student is going to need federal student aid in the form of loans, the FAFSA still is an eligibility checker for federal loans, which have some really good protections on them. Um, the rates for students are typically pretty good. We're going to go through what that qualifies for. So the FAFSA still helps in that way. It also gives parents access to the Parent Plus loan if that's your preferred method of borrowing. And those interest rates can be high, but if you're having some credit issues or some high debt to income ratios, that could be a good, strong option for you. You'll be eligible for up to $20,000 per year per student with a cap of $65,000 total per student on that. So again, we'll get into more details, but thank you for submitting that question. Happy to answer them along the way. If they're good for later, I might just say, well, we're going to get to that in a bit. All right, so today's topic is on submitting that FAFSA. Check back for other webinars that pair really well with this timeline. And let's kick off with what is the FAFSA. So this is the free application for federal student aid. Some of the things it checks for are grants, which don't have to be paid back, but it is very much sensitive to both income and assets. To go back to the question asked in the chat, debts, it's not as sensitive to. If those debts are against like investment properties or other assets, you want to calculate net worth. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But if it's things like credit card debt or car payments, etc., that's not going to help get you some of that grant free money aid. Free money is our favorite kind of money that doesn't have to be paid back. You do have to complete that FAFSA each year to be considered for that federal aid. You want to do that on the earlier side versus the later side because some aid can run out, particularly with state-based grants, as well as some of the school-based grants. At the beginning of the cycle, schools tend to have the most money and the most concern about filling their class. Like we said, I do always encourage people to file the FAFSA. Some people assume their income is too high and don't really understand how the calculations work and find that they do qualify for some aid. And sometimes FAFSAs are required to be considered for the merit-based aid that might have a small need component, but it not be the major driver of that consideration. So this is what the FAFSA can potentially get you access to depending on your results. So as I grab my little pointer here, it checks for your eligibility for Pell Grants, which is based on that financial need. The maximum you can qualify for is about $7,395 this year versus FSEOG grants up to $4,000. You're not going to find that out from filling out the FAFSA. It's FSEOG grants are given to the school to divide out how they see fit, but to those who have the highest need. So that's one of the programs that can run out in campus-based programs. So that's one of the reasons to file the FAFSA early. Federal work study basically gives your student the option to work on campus. Not that some schools will still allow students who don't qualify for work study to have a campus job, but schools can hire more folks within federal work study because it is subsidized by the Department of Education. So schools pay 25% of the salary out of their budgets, and 75% gets covered by the work study allocation. That's really designed to cover things like books and incidental fees, not to cover a major portion of tuition. And the student does have to work to earn those funds and will receive those funds as they are earned, just like any other job. Direct loans. These are available to all students up to $5,500 for the freshman year. It does have to be paid back. There is a subsidized option for that loan that does rely on a need-based component of the FAFSA. So that is that allocation, whether the loans are subsidized versus unsubsidized, is determined by the FAFSA. And the difference between those, just to outline those two words, the subsidized loan does not have you are not responsible for the interest accruing on that loan. The student is not responsible for the interest accruing on the loan, rather. Unsubsidized loans do accrue interest during school. And the maximum subsidized that a student can qualify for is $3,500. And so $2,000 of that $5,500, if you qualify via the FAFSA for subsidized, will absolutely be the unsubsidized. The other portion, it's a question of what your FAFSA results are. And then I mentioned the Parent Plus loan, up to $65,000 lifetime per student, but that's allocated for a max of $20K per year. And again, there's state aid from various schools. I know that this is a lot of information to absorb, and so don't panic if you're having some concerns already. Following along, it's very detailed. We will be sending out the presentation after tonight's webinar, along with some resources and some links. We record the webinar so you can rewatch it as often as you need to, or if you need to fall asleep at night and you want to listen to me talk about the details of federal aid, happy to do that for you. So essentially, we want to, again, do that early. And so the official deadline, you actually have, quite a while to do the FAFSA for this next upcoming year. June 30th, 2027 is when they close it, but most folks are doing it that October, 2025 for this previous cycle is the earliest you can do it through June 2027. So earlier is better than later, particularly for those SEOG and state grants. When you get the copy of this presentation, that'll have that live link there for all the state aid deadlines. And each individual school is going to have different deadlines. So I recommend making, a list, a spreadsheet, whatever works for you, of each school you or your student is interested in and the deadlines that they have for the FAFSA. All right, so who needs to submit? That depends on who you are and what your situation is. So I will get to this question that just popped in the chat about a student applying on their own without relying on parents, and will that help their eligibility? There are very strict rules on that we will cover in the next slide. So anyone who is required to provide information on your FAFSA is a contributor. Every contributor that's required must complete the FAFSA for it to be considered finished, complete, and on its way to the school. So every dependent student will need a contributor that is a parent unless they qualify for something called a dependency override. And so these are just 7 quick tests to figure out if the student is dependent or independent. So it's based on the age of the student. So we have those born before July 1st, 2023 for this year, or 2003 rather. So that means next year it'll be July 1st, 2004 for the 2027-2028 FAFSA. If they're married as of the application date, if they're a graduate or professional student, military, anyone who at any time after 13 was an orphan, foster child, or ward dependent of the court, an emancipated minor, or under legal guardianship as determined by your state, and homeless or at risk of homelessness. So those are the 7 essentially tests as to whether somebody is a dependent student or an independent student. So if a student does not meet one of these 7 criteria, they are considered dependent and will need a parent to complete the FAFSA with them. All right. Yeah. Let me see. That's a great question. And um, the question is, stepdaughter lives 50-50 with us versus biomom, but according to the FAFSA rules, which focus on who is the contributing parent, who contributes more of the financial amount to the student, is supposed to fill out the FAFSA. And technically, no, you're not supposed to fill out the FAFSA. You wouldn't be considered the contributing parent. And so that puts you in a really challenging position. I would talk to the schools where your stepdaughter is considering and ask if there is a way that you can be considered for institutional aid through the CSS profile. Some schools still require non-custodial parents. So both parents, regardless of the marital status, to fill those out. So you might still have that issue. But that is a very challenging situation. All right. I wish I had a better answer for you there. To complete the FAFSA, you determine who needs to submit. So essentially, there is a tool to figure that out. So if you are, for instance, let's see, I'm popping in there. This will help you determine, who should enter that based on the tips. So I'm going to pop that in the chat, and we'll go back to this situation. And when we're talking about parents, you want to know that the legal parent, they have to either be legal parents or biological or adoptive parents. And that's based on the state. So the parent listed on the birth certificate. If you have a situation where it's foster parents, legal guardians, grandparents, if it's not a legal adoption, essentially they are not supposed to be listed on the FAFSA form unless they have legally adopted the student. And so that would likely be a situation where a student would be ruled independent if they were living with other family members or guardians. All right, so each contributor does have to complete a FSA, create an FSA ID, an account on studentaid.gov. I'll grab that link as well for you now. Maybe. So we'll pop that in there so you can have access to that. You'll need your name, date of birth, and social security number. If you don't have one there is an alternative, but you must have an FSA ID before starting that form. Essentially, they'll match that, and it used to be a shorter wait. A longer wait, but usually they can immediately verify your identity by doing that. If you're not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, this sometimes happens with parents who are not U.S. citizens, but the children are, or sometimes there are eligible non-residents that can file the FAFSA. Those are typically those who are under certain, basically green card holders. There are certain statuses that advanced parolee status for some of those who are. I'm losing the word I'm looking for. There are some folks, some refugee statuses that are eligible for federal aid, but we'll need to use that alien registration number. And then I would have your W-2s and your tax returns handy, although now they require you to transfer that from the IRS automatically, which we're going to talk about in a slide or so. And that essentially means that for the most part, most of your tax return data, if not all of it, will be imported for you. But there are a couple of cases where this doesn't happen cleanly, and you'll need to potentially let the school know of some changes, or if you filed sometimes it doesn't work appropriately if you filed a correction to your tax return, an update to your tax return. So having them handy is a good idea. Records of untaxed income. So things that, again, child support received, veterans non-education benefits. You'll want a record of all of your assets, including savings and checking account balances, the value of any investments, stocks, bonds, real estate, and but that excludes your primary resident. And finally, you'll want to know which schools you're going to submit the FAFSA to. You can make changes if the student decides they want to apply to more schools later. You can apply to up to 20. So even if you haven't applied or been accepted yet, if you know where you're applying, it's easier just to add them than to have to go back into the form multiple times to fill updates. But you can add them later. You can also remove schools later. Sometimes this happens. Sometimes I've seen some very ambitious young people want to apply to more than 20 schools. And so what they'll have to do is send them and then wait for the schools to receive them, take a school off of the list, add another one on so that that gets sent to that school. Just be aware that that school that you took off won't get any updates if you need to correct your FAFSA. All right, so let's walk through completion. After you complete your FSA ID, you start the application at studentaid.gov. That's where you'll find the FAFSA. You indicate whether you are a student or a parent. Either one can start the app, and then the other contributor will get an invite to complete their section of the form. As I mentioned, you now are required to consent to the IRS transferring tax data to your FAFSA form. Again, you're basically forced to give that information to the school. All right. 5 sections you need to complete. I just, it occurred to me with a question earlier about the parent refusing to provide the FAFSA or fill out the FAFSA. I don't know the situation there, but sometimes the concern there has been, they don't want the other parent in a divorced situation to know how much they earn, or to know details about their financial situation. And that FAFSA data is private. The schools are not supposed to share that. And, if it makes the other parent feel better to, put that on record to the schools that their FAFSA data is not to be shared, via phone or give any indication of what that FAFSA does, that could potentially make give the other parent some assurance there. So just one idea to broach that subject. All right, so 5 sections that we need to complete. And we'll cover the key pieces you need to know. So this is the piece that determines that independent status versus dependent status. So if the student is independent, they do not need a parent contributor. We've gone through these 7 pieces. If you click none of these apply, then the parent information is required. They'll ask some demographics questions. This does not impact your financial aid in any way, shape, or form. And then it goes on to your 2024 tax information. So if you filled that out, will be automatically filled for you. But if not, if you filed a correction, if you weren't required to file taxes, you'll at least need the data that is included in the 2024 tax return. So big pro to using older tax information is, so let's say for our junior parents on the call, next year it'll be 2025, right? And you can do that in October. You will have your 2020, most people will have their 2025 tax returns done around April. And so by October, you absolutely have that data. It used to be more recent data, but that meant that people couldn't file their FAFSA, the final pieces of their FAFSA, until their tax returns were done for that year. So the prior year data gives financial aid offices, families the ability to provide data earlier and to get a financial aid award offer earlier. But that also means that there's more time for changes in family situation. So if your income has gone substantially down since 2024, you may want to file one of those appeals that I mentioned earlier in the call and have the financial aid office review and make allocations for that. They have from Congress the power to make something called professional judgment, where they can make changes to the FAFSA if they have documentation and update that for you. That could potentially get you some grant eligibility. It could potentially allow you subsidized versus unsubsidized loans. So it's absolutely worth exploring. Now, here's where most people make mistakes, right? Because it is not, the FAFSA doesn't, for most of us, doesn't let us make those changes to the tax data because that's official data. And so it fills it out for us. So really the assets are where you have the ability to put in the information and potentially make mistakes. So you want to include the value of cash, savings, and checking account, your net worth of investments, including real estate, but there's been a recent change, and you only include that if your business or farm has or your business has more than 100 full-time employees, so you don't have to count assets from small businesses. And you don't want to include primary residence or retirement accounts. You're also not going to include farms where you don't live. And we're going to cover this in a little more detail here. So do not include the value of things like your possessions, but you should include things in your assets for checking account savings balances. That's in this area. I do want to point out, probably a lot of people are familiar with when they see these information buttons, but they are incredibly helpful when filling out the FAFSA. They will give you pop-ups telling you what you should include or shouldn't include. I recommend, if there's even a shadow of a doubt, even if there's not a shadow of a doubt, hit that information button, read through it just to make sure you're reporting the correct information. All right, so that's that piece. Just keep in mind, as of the day the FAFSA is filed. So we'll hit this in another slide, but timing is important. So if you've been saving up for something that is not educational expense related, you might want to time that purchase appropriately for it not to count towards your FAFSA, because again, it's as of the day it was filed. If you have that flexibility to time those purchases, that can certainly benefit you. All right. So moving on to the next piece, current net worth of investments. Let's talk about what not to include. So you don't want to include your primary home that you live in. You don't want to include any retirement accounts and non-education IRAs, etc. Any ABLE accounts, life insurance value, including cash value, and 529 plans from someone who is not a required contributor. So grandparents, 529 plans, aunt, uncle, 529 plans, etc., do not get reported there. They actually don't get reported anywhere on the FAFSA. So just a quick tip and trick on that. If you have another family member outside of the parents that's planning to pay for college out of a 529 plan, again, timing becomes key, because it is actually included as cash received on the student's FAFSA in 2 years. So because of the prior year data. So typically, if it's not enough to cover all 4 years, timing that for like the junior and senior year so that it doesn't come into the need-based component can help some families as well. And then 529 plans for the student that's not the student you're filing the FAFSA for on their behalf. All right. And then we only want to include the net worth of businesses more than 100 full-time or full-time equivalent employees, and only of income producing farms that are owned but not the primary residence of the family. Again, the chat is open for questions, comments, etc. Though I hesitate to say comments because I have no control over what's on this FAFSA. We'll make this very important note. If your family size has changed since your taxes were filed, you want to update this family size. Family size has a pretty substantial impact on how that student aid index is calculated. So if your family size has gotten larger, your calculated need will likely go up, which means you might qualify for additional aid versus if you left it alone. All right. Number in college used to be, back when I was doing undergraduate financial aid, that the number in college did impact your need. Your used to be called, it didn't used to be called the student aid index, it used to be called the estimated family contribution, and the impact it was felt by students and families. But it no longer utilizes number in college to calculate need, but it is something you can ask the college itself to consider for their institutional aid. They may or may not look at that. They may or may not factor that in. If they do, I mentioned earlier, the CSS profile, that's a more in-depth form than the FAFSA, and they may account for it in those questions. They may not. It's going to depend from institution to institution. All right. Question here about, will the student be allowed to pay the unsubsidized loan while still attending college, or do they have to wait to graduate first and then start paying the loan back? It is not required for them to make payments while they're in school. It's going to automatically be in deferment, but there are never any prepayment penalties on any student loans, and the student can always voluntarily make payments towards those loans. They tend to go to interest first. And then once the interest is paid off, they go to principal. So they do not have to wait if they want to pay it back. Though a little bit of a tip and trick here, hack, if you will. If any payments made either back from the school or from the student towards that loan, if it's made within 120 days of disbursement, all interest and fees are backed out as if that part of the loan never existed. So making payments before that 120 days can in fact help. If you have the school return it, if something were to happen and you needed to reborrow the amount that you repaid, you would then still retain that access, where you wouldn't if the student made the payments themselves or the family was making payments on that. So it's a little bit safer to be like, okay, well, I want to borrow to start, but 3 or 4 months into the semester, I've saved up an extra $1,000. I want to return that part of the loan. All that interest and the 1% origination fee on that loan would be backed out as if that never existed. Probably more details than you wanted, but I love that hack personally. All right. Okay. So, hopping into the next section, you must list at least one college or trade school on the FAFSA, up to 20 schools. I mentioned this before. Some states have specific requirements for the order in which schools are listed to be considered for state aid programs. It's impossible to be fully on board with every potential state program. So you want to make sure you're checking out the one for your state. Again, I'll put that in the chat and you will get a copy of this presentation with all the hyperlinks as well. We have in there Massachusetts in particular. Grant aid awards will be made for the first eligible college listed on the FAFSA. Notify your state agency if you change that going forward. All right, the last step is to sign and submit. Once all sections are complete, you've got to sign that form and electronically submit. You want to make sure you receive that confirmation from all contributors. And then it takes a couple of days to see your full student aid index. You'll get an estimate first, but you'll see the full submission summary typically within 1 to 3 days. And you'll log in, you'll get an email when that's ready. You'll log into that studentaid.gov account with your FSA ID. You view your FAFSA submission summary. There'll be an eligibility overview tab. It'll tell you your estimated eligibility for a Pell Grant if you qualify, for federal student loans, and it'll tell you your student aid index. That's a number. It can be negative all the way up to 999,000. Typically, not typically, all the time, the lower your SAI, the higher your financial need. And that's how schools use the data to allocate their federal aid, student aid, and sometimes their institutional aid if they are a school that offers need-based aid. Merit-based aid is typically not driven by the FAFSA. But that is not your financial aid offer. It doesn't tell you how much aid you're going to receive. It doesn't represent what you're going to have to pay out of pocket. So it's just a starting point. And it's to give the financial aid office the information they need to check your federal eligibility and to run that through their institutional eligibility criteria. You will receive that aid offer typically around the time you receive an admission to the school. So as we kind of wrap up this section, some key things to remember. I mentioned if you're considering a large purchase, you have a lot sitting in that cash savings piece, do it before submitting the FAFSA. That will reduce your available assets and drive your SAI down. This is especially important for students versus parents, because if you attend our SAI webinar, where we dive deep into this, the student assets are considered at a much higher rate than the parents. They protect more of the parents' assets against being considered because parents have other things to pay for, like retirement, other expenses, where if students have savings, it's typically expected that they put most of that or a large portion of that towards their education experiences. Keep in mind you're reporting net value of assets. That's the equities. So if you have rental properties, the value of that rental property minus the mortgage of that rental property, not just the value of the property. So make sure you're putting against whatever debts are against that asset. Mention the grandparent 529 plans. They're not to be considered. Look at that family size, and if your income has gone down or there's other substantive changes, you want to talk to the financial aid office, see what information they need to review your FAFSA and make updates there. So let's say you don't get everything you need in that free grant money and you're going to need to borrow. We do help families navigate that process. So the students have access to that $5,500. If families need to borrow more than that, there are a couple of options. If your student is already enrolled You do not need to, there are no changes impacting you, but if your student is newly entering, there will be those new caps I mentioned, $20,000 a year or $65,000 in a lifetime limit. We offer all of our assistance is for free, but we do help folks navigate the private loan market. We essentially aggregate volume. We put groups of people together, undergrad, graduates, and various degrees, and then we take those members to a lender and say, hey, what can you give our members that is better than they could get on their own? So we're essentially advocating on your behalf for lower rates and better eligibility requirements than the broader market based on group volume. So if there's any chance you'll need a loan next year, we're encouraging folks to sign up for our negotiation group now. There is absolutely no commitment. It literally just helps our negotiation power, helps other families get access to better rate loans. So if you think that it is, if you think there's a chance that you'll need this loan, sign up for our negotiation group at joinjuno.com. We will run a bid in May. We're talking to lenders now to start those negotiations. We release our deals for the next year in June. So again, no commitment, no cost, free for families. We do not do a credit check when you sign up. You're not obligated. We give you free one-on-one financial aid support over email, phone, or Zoom. Basically, it's like we've had people describe it as like Costco, but without the membership fee. So again, let me just grab that link. See, there's a question in the chat. Let me take a look at that. This question is about an insurance settlement, and that being in the bank account, they're allocated for rebuilding our home. Must the insurance proceeds be reported on the FAFSA? Technically, if they're in those accounts, they are supposed to be, if it's on the day of the FAFSA, but that is something that you could likely document and have the financial aid office do a professional judgment on your behalf. But if you are filling it out as to the letter of the law, it should be. But I know as a former director of financial aid, that would be something that I would be very comfortable making an adjustment for, given, the natural disaster that precipitated the loss of a home, and that, the rebuilding process is not immediate. So that is, I would potentially talk to aid offices even before you submit to FAFSA, just so you're aware of what they are and are not willing to do. But I know a good amount of folks in the profession that would feel very comfortable making those adjustments. All right. I did promise you I would give you a brand new overview of our tool that we launched today. I tested this, and again, I was very skeptical when I was told this was being developed, because I've read a lot of appeal letters over my time, my nearly 15 to 20 years in financial aid or financial education. And I had to admit I was very, very impressed with this tool, because my initial reaction was the last thing I would want to read when I was a financial aid director is like gobs of auto-generated appeals. And it's not, though it certainly helps people write it, it's not a plug and play. I popped through some mediocre inputs and was very impressed with the output. So essentially, you can use this either as someone who's starting college soon or already enrolled. As you're going through, you can choose whether it's merit or need-based reconsideration, dependency override request, to let's say something has changed in your family circumstances. You can click all that apply. It doesn't have to be one or the other. One-time income on tax return is a big one. A lot of folks, maybe they got a settlement or something that had to be counted as income tax, or maybe they took a one-time withdrawal from a retirement for some unusual circumstances. That could be a good cause for appeal. So you select the pieces that apply for merit appeals. We'll have you'll put in what your cost and grants and loans are at various institutions. The tool will take a look at that and see what is the strongest argument. It'll ask for things that have changed since you've submitted that merit appeal, so awards, GPAs, etc. Job loss for the need-based appeals, you'll select the reasons and provide a little bit of information. It just makes it a lot easier than starting from scratch. It'll generate your appeal letter, guide you on which supporting evidence would benefit, bolstering your case. So it'll, in this situation, a termination letter, final pay stub for mother's job because the situation was a loss of income, unemployment documentation. A lot of times if you're saying, hey, there's another offer that's strongly compelling, schools will want to see a copy of that other letter. So we'll give you all of that. Again, free tool, try it out. Let us know what you think. And we hope that it's helpful for you. And so I hope that the whole presentation was helpful this evening. Would like to just pause and see if anyone has any questions before I let you go on with your evening. Anything we didn't answer in this session, please feel free to put that in either place. If a student has a sibling with a disability, does that contribute towards the FAFSA application, or would that be an appeal or not at all? So, a lot of times folks with disabled family members have higher expenses because of those medical costs, bills, support needs, and that's not typically accounted for in the FAFSA. But absolutely, you should talk to your financial aid office about that. Because they can look at making adjustments against income, either on the FAFSA or on the institutional need-based side. If they're using the CSS profile, they have more flexibility on the institutional need-based aid than they do on federal. But if you can document, significant expenses tied into that disability, then a lot of financial aid offices will consider that. And make adjustments as needed. All right, well, I'm glad that, I'm happy that I got to present that. Thank you for your thank yous. I think I see a Q&A popping up here. Yeah, if a wealthy aunt gifts money towards tuition, but it's a year-by-year basis, and aunt gives directly to the school to cover a percent of tuition, how do we report that in the FAFSA, knowing it might not be recurring every year? Yeah, it's again that the timing becomes important because it's going to ask about cash gifts for the student. And so if they do it in the first year, then it's going to catch up to the need-based calculation in the junior year, sophomore year, senior year, etc. So it is more strategic to have those be in the later years, particularly if you're getting a large need-based award from the school. So I don't know if the family member is open to having that conversation, but essentially it would only be reported 2 years after, so it will impact 2 academic years later. I hope that's helpful for answering that question. How do we know if we're eligible for a grant? So for federal grants, particularly, I apologize if you heard my dog barking. For federal grants, essentially the the FAFSA will determine that. You'll know if you're eligible for a Pell Grant when you get that financial aid or that FAFSA submission summary. And that will say, hey, you're eligible for a Pell Grant up to a certain amount. That's gonna be based off a formula of the school's cost of attendance and the FAFSA results, but you'll know if you qualify for that federal grant when you get that submission back from the FAFSA. SEOG and all institutional grants are going to come with your financial aid offer from the school, which again is typically around admission, most frequently in the March and April timeframe. And then you get the whole picture of the total cost of attendance and your free money grant aid. Merit-based aid is given institution by institution, and that is, different accomplishments are weighed, a lot of times GPA, SAT, ACT score, student involvement, etc. And then always encourage students to apply for as many external scholarships as possible to reduce their potential loan burden as well. All right. I think I've gotten all the questions that have been submitted so far. If you're still working on a question, go ahead and use the raise hand function so that I can know that you're still typing out. Otherwise, I'll let you have a wonderful evening and come back and join us for future webinars. All right. Have a great night.